The missing girl's bedroom had already been searched 6 times before I stepped into it, and rooms like that always told on people. Not because they held secrets, but because everyone who'd gone through them left behind a version of what they expected to find. The carpet still smelled faintly like lemon cleaner over old dust. The window frame sweated cold even though the night outside was dry. Somewhere beyond the yard, I could hear the thin electrical buzz of power lines. There weren't any power lines on that side of the property. I moved the coats in the closet aside, one sleeve at a time, listening to the hangers tick against the rod. The back wall had been painted over at least twice. New white over old cream, nail holes patched. One patch had failed. I pressed it with my thumb and felt paper underneath. I peeled the loose square back. A photograph hung there behind the coats. Family portraits don't belong inside closet walls. That's the kind of thing that made my neck tighten before my brain had a chance to name it. I pulled it free and held it toward the bedroom lamp. The mother was smiling. The father was smiling. The missing girl was smiling. Even the little brother I hadn't been told about yet was smiling. Outside the bedroom window, behind the glass in the picture, a figure stood in the yard. It wasn't smiling. I turned and looked at the real window. The pane was black. My reflection looked back at me, pale and flat. Then something knocked once from the other side. Not loud, just polite. My eyes started to ache. That deep pressure behind them like I'd been reading in bad light for hours. And all I could think was this: why did everybody remember the knock? But nobody ever remembered what came after it. That was 3 days into the case. Black Creek, Missouri, sat in a fold of the Ozarks where the roads narrowed without warning and every porch seemed to have the same 2 chairs on it. One occupied and one not. By the time I got there, the missing girl had been gone for nights. Long enough for the town to stop treating it like a teenage runaway and start lowering its voice when it said her name. I parked outside the sheriff's office just after noon. The air smelled like hot gravel and cut grass, but underneath that there was another smell, older and damp, like wet wood left to swell in a shed. I didn't notice then how often that smell would show up before something impossible did. I only registered it because it didn't belong on a dry day. Sheriff Miriam Jovas met me in a hallway lined with donation plaques and old football photos. She had the posture of somebody who'd spent years making herself the stillest person in every room. Not stiff, controlled. Her office coffee had gone burnt on the warmer, and the desk beside her carried stacks of paper clipped so straight they might have been measured. I didn't call for outside help, Sheriff Miriam Jovas told me. I know, I said. But the state office sent me anyway. That wasn't completely true. My job lived in a gray strip between state agencies, private retainers, and sheriffs who learned there were certain cases easier not to classify too clearly. Officially, I handled patterns in disappearances that crossed county lines. Unofficially, people sent for me when normal explanations started needing too much maintenance. Sheriff Miriam Jovas studied me for a second, then slid a folder across her desk. You're here because 3 statements match too well. I opened the file. That's part of it. Then tell me what the other part is. Could have lied. I usually did, at least a little. But something about Black Creek made that feel cheap. Because everybody heard a knock. Because nobody remembers opening the door. And because when that many people forget the same step in the same sequence, it usually means the memory didn't fail on its own. Sheriff Miriam Jovas didn't like that answer. I could tell by the way her jaw shifted once and settled again. But she didn't throw me out. Instead she said, "You get 2 days. Then I decide whether you're helping or muddying my case." I spent the rest of that afternoon reading witness interviews in the small conference room off dispatch. The room smelled like copier toner and old paper, and the fluorescent light above me hummed just below the pitch of a headache. There were 8 statements total from neighbors, family, and one delivery driver who'd happened to be on the road that night. They'd been taken independently, different times, different rooms. Sheriff Miriam Jovas had done for herself. One deputy had done the others, and they all leaned on the same details like people remembering a movie they'd seen together. A knock after dark. Not pounding. Not urgent. 3 slow taps. The sense that somebody familiar was outside. Curtains moving. a shape near the porch, then uncertainty, blank space, then morning. The same phrases appeared too often. A feeling of being expected. Like I had to answer. Maybe a dream. Those last 2 words came up in 5 statements. I hated that. Real witnesses reached for different language. Bad memory still had texture. But these interviews had been sanded down until the details fit together too neatly. By evening, I'd added a rule to the inside of my head, even if I didn't say it aloud yet. When multiple people described identical details in a case like this, those details were probably the part one needed to distrust first. I started the interviews again in person. The missing girl's mother had the dry smell of laundry soap on her sweater and skin rubbed raw around her thumbs. Every time I asked her about the knock, she pressed 2 fingers between her eyebrows like she could physically hold the memory in place. I heard it, she said. I know I did. But after that it gets slippery. Slippery how? Like trying to remember something from right after waking up. Her eyes watered, not from crying. From strain. It hurts to think about. That got my attention. I asked 2 more witnesses, then 3. Same gesture. Same pressure behind the eyes. One older man wiped at his face and said, embarrassed. Feels like my head doesn't want me in there. While they talked, their hands moved on their own. I noticed it with the delivery driver first. He was tracing a shape on his jeans with 1 finger, absent-minded, while he answered me. Curl. Tight center. Widening loops. After him, the missing girl's aunt did the same thing on a paper napkin. A neighbor did it in condensation on her tea glass. Spiral after spiral, all of them drawn without looking down. Not one of them mentioned it. That detail seemed minor then. I have thought about it every day since. By nightfall, Black Creek had gone quiet in the way small towns do when everybody has agreed, without saying so, to stay indoors. The motel room Sheriff Miriam Jovas had arranged for me smelled like stale air conditioner and old cigarette smoke trapped under newer paint. I spread the witness photos over the bedspread and stared at the empty places between what they remembered. The knock, the pressure behind the eyes, the identical language, the spirals. If I treated it like a normal abduction, I had nothing. No forced entry. No meaningful prints. No ransom contact. If I treated it like one of the cases that found their way to me, I had too much. Too many people forgetting the same thing. Too many little signs of memory being steered instead of lost. And I still thought I was asking the right question. I thought I was looking for what had taken one girl. The next morning, I walked the missing girls street before the heat got bad. The neighborhood was only 3 blocks long. A run of modest homes with chain link fences, cracked bird baths, and plastic toys gone pale in the sun. Dogs barked when I passed, then stopped too quickly, like they were reconsidering. The air smelled like damp mulch and last night's rain, though there hadn't been any rain. Again I caught that odor of wet wood, faint but steady, and under it the thin buzz of distant lines. Still no lines overhead. I stood at the curb and looked at the houses one by one. The missing girl's place sat between a yellow ranch on one side and a white 2-story on the other. I checked the folder, then the street, then the folder again. The lot dimensions listed on the tax sheet didn't make sense. Too wide for what I was seeing. I paced it off from mailbox to mailbox, listening to gravel crunch under my shoes. The width between the yellow house and the white one was wrong by almost a full residence. There should have been another house there. Not a shack. Not a garage. A house. I spent an hour making sure I wasn't embarrassing myself. Old tax maps in the county annex showed 3 properties where 2 now stood. Utility service records listed a meter number assigned to an address that no longer appeared on the current map. A newspaper photo from a 4th of July parade, years old and sun-faded, showed children riding bikes in front of 3 porches on that block. 3. In the present, there were only 2. I took the photo back outside and stood where it must have been taken. My skin prickled before I figured out why. The missing space wasn't empty. It was landscaped over in that quiet, practical way towns erase things. One side yard extended too far. A vegetable patch sat where a foundation should have been. Somebody had let grass and habit do the rest. I knocked on the yellow house first. The woman who answered smelled like onions and hand lotion. She stared at me with that flat courtesy people use when they're already tired of a subject. "I'm looking into the disappearance next door," I said. "I wanted to ask about the property line between your house and the Wilcox place." She frowned. "You've already asked me that." The sentence hit hard enough that I actually looked behind me, like somebody else might be standing there. "I don't think so," I said. Her expression didn't change. "Yesterday, on the porch, you had the same notebook." A cold thread moved through my chest. "Ma'am, I wasn't here yesterday." She squinted, and for a second I thought she'd argue. Instead, her face loosened, almost all at once. Her fingertips went to the bridge of her nose. Maybe it was somebody else. Did he look like me? That pressure started in my own head then, a slow tightening behind my eyes. "I don't know," she said. I can't picture him now." She shut the door gently, like she was ending a church conversation. I stood on the porch with my notebook open and nothing written on the page. That was the first moment I considered the possibility that this case had started working on me before I knew I was in it. I went to the county records room after that because paper was steadier than people. The room sat in a basement that smelled like mildew, dust, and cardboard gone soft at the edges. Metal shelves sagged with plat maps and deed books. I found the vanished address in a ledger from 1994. Then a fire insurance map from 1981. Then a maintenance request for sewer access from 2003. Every document said the same thing in different language. A residence had stood between those houses. It had existed long enough to be taxed, serviced, photographed, and repaired. There was no demolition permit, no fire report, no insurance claim, no county order to condemn. Nothing that explained how a house became a gap in memory instead of a matter of record. By the time I brought that to Sheriff Miriam Jovas, her office had gone warm and close from the afternoon sun pressing through the blinds. She smelled like coffee gone cold and the leather of her duty belt. I laid the records across her desk. "There was another house on that street," I said. Sheriff Miriam Jovas looked at the papers, then at me. "No, there wasn't." I pointed at the maps. "Then what am I holding?" "Old mistakes. From 3 different offices over 20 years? Sheriff Miriam Jovas didn't answer right away. That bothered me more than if she'd laughed. Finally she said, "My father grew up on that block. He'd have told me if there'd been another house. He might not remember it." That landed badly. I knew it the second it left my mouth. But she didn't get angry. She just went very still. "I've lived here 46 years, she said. "If you're suggesting a house vanished and everybody forgot, you better have more than a stack of bad maps." I gathered the papers and left, because I didn't. Not yet. What I had was one impossible absence and a witness who thought she'd already met me. At the time, I still believed the erased house was the center of the case. It wasn't even the door. Edwin Lowell Granger worked in the Black Creek Historical Archive, which sounded grander than it was. The archive occupied the 2nd floor of an old feed supply building with warped pine floors and windows that stuck in their frames. The place smelled so strongly of paper and wetwood that I stopped in the doorway and just breathed for a second. Not because it was pleasant, but because it was familiar. Encounter sites all over the country carried that same layered odor, as if damp cellulose announced the edges of whatever lived near forgotten places. Edwin Lowell Granger looked built from the archive itself. Thin wrists, dust on his cuffs, white hair combed straight back from a narrow face. He wore a vest despite the heat and handled folders like they contained sleeping things. Sheriff Miriam Jovas had mentioned him with the tone people use for harmless obsessives. Local historian, knows every family, talks too much. She was right about the last part. When I told Edwin Lowell Granger what I was looking for, his eyes sharpened in a way that didn't match his mild voice. "Disappearances with residue," he said. "Not evidence. Residue." I watched him carefully. "What do you mean by that?" "The part left in memory after the real thing is removed." He turned and led me through rows of stacked boxes. "Most people think forgetting is absence. It isn't. It's a replacement material. Something has to fill the shape. That wasn't normal archivist talk. He brought me to a table already crowded with county clippings, handwritten notes, and file folders tied in cloth ribbon. I hadn't asked him to prepare anything. He untied the first bundle and spread photographs between us. Farmhouses, riverbanks, empty cribs, school portraits, faces from Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Illinois, different decades, same uneasy, ordinary quality. Every case involved a disappearance. Every one had witness statements with strange repetition or gaps. In one, a family remembered their barn door swinging open by itself, but couldn't recall who'd noticed first. In another, 5 factory workers heard somebody singing from an abandoned loading dock, yet none agreed on the tune, only that they'd known it. Again and again there were missing steps in recollection, pressure headaches, dreams people later defended as facts. They aren't local events, Edwin Lowell Granger said. They're neighboring events. That's different. I didn't like how sure he sounded. You think these are connected by folklore? No, he said. Folklore is what happens after a community loses the ability to report accurately. That line stuck. We spent hours there. Dust dried my throat. The building creaked around us as the sun shifted, and every now and then the strange line buzz would rise under the silence. Though there were no transformers nearby, no obvious source. Edwin Lowell Granger showed me marginalia from old sheriffs, clipped letters from traveling salesmen, a school nurse's notebook from the 1960s in which 3 children had all drawn the same spiral after reporting something under the bleachers. That shape again, I said. He nodded once. A routing mark. A what? That's my word for it, he said. I don't know theirs. The fact that he had an answer ready for that told me he had been waiting years for somebody to ask the wrong question. I kept going through the files because even when I didn't like a theory, I respected consistency. And the consistency here was obscene. Case after case, the first witness account was the least reliable. People corrected themselves later, not toward clarity, but toward something rougher and more fragmented. That led me to another rule, though I still resisted calling them rules. Witnesses never remembered the first encounter correctly. The first memory came already edited. Then I started checking the age of the structures tied to sightings. Abandoned barns, closed mills, empty houses, disused schools, a theater with vines through the marquee. They weren't random. Nothing under 5 years. Not one. I circled dates in my notebook until the pattern annoyed me enough to say it aloud. Whatever's using these places doesn't move in fresh. Edwin Lowell Granger glanced up from an index card. No. It waits until human habit dies first. That sentence sent a chill through me, not because it was dramatic, but because it sounded observed. I looked at him. How long have you believed this? Edwin Lowell Granger smiled without humor. Believe is a church word. I've cataloged it for 32 years. Before I left, he handed me a thin folder that hadn't been in the main pile. Read this one tonight. What is it? A case from Kansas. 2 brothers missing from a farmhouse road. Everybody remembered a lantern in the field. The sheriff wrote in the margin that if all witnesses agreed on the lantern, then there probably hadn't been one. I took the file. At the bottom of the last page was a note in a dead man's handwriting, cramped and slanted from age. Every missing person case connected to this pattern contains one deliberate clue. Not evidence. An invitation. I drove back to the motel with the file on the passenger seat and the smell of old paper still in my clothes. Until then, I had been trying to prove Black Creek was stranger than it looked. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was starting to think the real problem was how ordinary the rest of the map had pretended to be. The grain elevator stood outside town near a weeded service road where the gravel turned gray with old runoff. Sheriff Miriam Jovas had mentioned it on my first day, but only as another abandoned place kids used for dares. Edwin Lowell Granger's files brought it back up. 3 separate witness paths crossed within half a mile of it. A dog had gone missing near it in spring. A delivery driver had mistaken it for a water tower in a statement that otherwise made no sense. Once I started treating abandoned structures as potential organs in a larger body, the elevator moved to the top of the list. I checked the place at dusk. The metal skin held the day's heat and gave off that dry, rusted smell that sticks in the back of your throat. But beneath that was the odor I knew too well now. Wet wood. Moldy paper. Impossible inside a concrete service building with steel walls. The lot around it was silent except for insects and that faraway electric hum, steady enough to make me grind my teeth. There were no recent footprints at the main entrance, but there were marks in the dust on the north side. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, just scuffed interruptions, as if something tall had moved there without putting its full weight down. I found a maintenance ladder bolted to the exterior and a camera someone from the county had mounted years back to monitor trespassers. The feed still routed to a storage unit in Sheriff Miriam Jovas's office. I watched the footage with her just after midnight. At first there was nothing but static grain and moths crossing the lens. Then, at 2 in the morning, a shape moved along the far fence line. It was roughly human in the shallow way mannequins are roughly human. Too tall for the gate opening it approached, but when it reached the entry it didn't duck. Its head angled before its body did, like the decision to enter had traveled through it out of order. One frame showed an arm, I think. It bent at one joint too many. Sheriff Miriam Jovas exhaled through her nose. Could be distortion. Could be. But we both knew better. The image blurred exactly when the shape crossed the threshold. Not from motion. From interference. The screen fuzzed, the audio popped, and then the feed smoothed out with the thing gone. They avoided being photographed. I had seen that before in lesser ways. Reflections lost focus. Polaroids stuck blank in the middle. Trail cameras caught only the moment before or after. But this was the first time I understood the second half of the pattern. If they couldn't stop the camera, they corrupted the memory around the image instead. People would argue over the blur and stop asking what had stepped through it. I told Sheriff Miriam Jovas I wanted a stakeout. She didn't answer immediately. The office smelled like printer ink and cold fries from somebody's late dinner. You think that's our girl? I think it's our contact point. That's not what I asked. I looked at the frozen frame. The shape on the monitor didn't frighten me in the usual way. I wasn't imagining claws or teeth. What unsettled me was the movement, that subtle mismatch in sequence, as if it had learned body language from reports rather than anatomy. I think if anything in this case physically took her, it went through that building. That was the wrong conclusion. It was also a reasonable one, and reasonable mistakes are the most expensive kind. We went out the following night with 2 deputies positioned at the road and Sheriff Miriam Jovas with me in the pump house 50 yards off. The boards under our boots were soft with rot. The room smelled like mouse droppings, damp insulation, and old oil. I had a camera, a flashlight, a sidearm I didn't expect to matter, and 3 pages of notes I kept rereading to make sure they stayed the same. At 1:30, the buzz started. Louder this time. Not outside. Under us. Current in the ground. Sheriff Miriam Jovas heard it too. I could tell by the way she shifted her shoulders. No theatrics. No questions. Just acknowledgement. Then came the knock. 3 taps. Not on our door. On the side of the elevator across the lot. My mouth went dry. Sheriff Miriam Jovas looked at me once, then back through the cracked slat in the wall. The figure appeared at the base of the structure, so suddenly I couldn't tell where it had come from. It wasn't tall in the simple sense. It was vertically wrong, all length and pause, with limbs that seemed to finish arriving a beat after the rest of it. It rested one hand against the corrugated metal and stayed there, listening. The fingers were thin and pale at the tips, almost papery, as if they'd been soaked and dried too many times. Then it turned its face toward our hiding place. I couldn't make out features. I only knew it had located us without looking directly in our direction first. Sheriff Miriam Jovas whispered. Now. We moved fast. Flashlights up. Deputies shouting from the road. Gravel kicking under our boots. The figure crossed the lot with impossible economy. Not running, just covering too much ground per step. It slipped through the side access and into the elevator. We followed. The air inside hit me like the inside of a basement after flood season. Wet wood. Grain dust. Paper rot. My light found ladders, chutes, old control panels, and a door hanging open behind a stack of pallets. Beyond it, stairs dropped underground. That surprised all of us. No plans had shown a tunnel system. Sheriff Miriam Jo Voss swore under her breath and went first. I was right behind her. The tunnel walls were reinforced in timber gone black with moisture. The buzz was almost painful there, trembling in my molars. Ahead of us something moved, not crashing, not frantic, measured, confident, as if retreat had been chosen before we ever arrived. Then the passage forked, and in the center of the packed dirt floor was the spiral. Not drawn, worn there by passage. We split for seconds that felt longer. Left side, nothing. Right side, nothing. The tunnel opened to a collapsed chamber and dead ended in sloughed clay and roots. No second exit. No body. No sound except our breathing and the faint, hateful hum in the walls. Gone. One deputy started saying it had to be a drifter. Sheriff Miriam Jo Voss shut that down with a look before he got halfway through the sentence. We searched until dawn and found only old boards, rust flakes, and one object tucked under a beam where no flood should have carried it. A school composition notebook, dry despite the damp, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were names, dozens of them, some crossed out, some underlined, some marked with a spiral in the margin. The missing girl's name was on the third page. So were two names from Edwin Lowell Granger's archive in other states years apart. I thought that notebook meant we had our culprit. I thought the tunnel beneath the elevator was the nest. I didn't understand yet that we'd only cornered one moving part in a machine too large to see from ground level. For a week after the stakeout, Black Creek exhaled. That was the only word for it. The town didn't become happy. It became willing to move again. Porch lights stayed on later. The diner filled back up at breakfast. A woman who had refused to let her son walk to the mailbox alone stopped checking the road every few minutes. Even the witness interviews changed. People regained confidence, but not accuracy. They spoke with the flat relief of people who had agreed on a story solid enough to stand on. Sheriff Miriam Jo Voss wanted to believe we had disrupted whatever had been operating out of the grain elevator. So did I. The notebook felt like structure. It gave us names to cross-reference, dates to pull, enough physical reality to push back against the fog that had wrapped the rest of the case. Then my own notes started slipping. The first change was small. An interview page I'd filled in blue ink now carried one extra sentence in black, written between lines I knew had been empty. Ask the mother about the brother in the photograph. I stared at it for a full minute in the motel room while the air conditioner rattled and blew cold damp air over my hands. I did have a black pen. The handwriting looked like mine. I had no memory of writing it. At the time I assumed exhaustion. Too little sleep. Too much pattern matching. My kind of work ate people that way if they let it. So I checked the rest of the notebook. A page from my first day now listed an address I hadn't investigated yet. A margin beside the grain elevator sketch carried a note reading not source. Relay. Same hand. My hand. Same pressure, same slant. I sat on the bed and listened to the distant hum outside the motel until I realized it wasn't outside at all. It was inside my head. The contamination had started. Once I knew to look, I found more. A recorded interview I'd made with the missing girl's aunt existed on my digital recorder, but my typed summary of it was gone. A witness statement I remembered reading twice had vanished from the folder in Sheriff Miriam Jo Voss's office. When I asked her for it, she said there had never been such an interview. I was in the room, I said. Sheriff Miriam Jo Voss smelled like rain on wool that day, though the sky was clear. Garrett Owen Sutter, you were not. I remember the wallpaper in her kitchen. So do I, she said. Because you described it to me yesterday and then couldn't tell me her address. That shut me up. Later, I went back through my motel trash, my jacket pockets, every loose paper in the car. I found a folded sheet inside the Kansas file Edwin Lowell Granger had given me. It had been hidden behind the back cover so cleanly I might have missed it a dozen times. The paper was newer than the rest. My handwriting again. If a witness remembers too much, another witness begins forgetting. I had never written that sentence. But I knew it was true the moment I read it, the way you can recognize a rule your body has already been obeying. The missing girl's mother had started recalling little domestic details again, what song had been on the radio, what her daughter wore to bed, the smell of shampoo in the bathroom. At the same time, the delivery driver who had given the clearest timeline now couldn't remember being on that road at all. Memory wasn't just being erased. It was being redistributed. That realization cracked the false victory clean open. I went back to the elevator alone that night and found the tunnel entrance boarded up from the inside. Fresh boards. No tool marks on the outer nails. The composition notebook from beneath the beam had lost 4 pages since we logged it into evidence. The names removed were all ones I'd flagged against out-of-state cases. The pages hadn't been torn. They had become absence, with only faint shadow impressions left in the paper beneath. I took those impressions to Edwin Lowell Granger. The archive was closed, but he let me in through the side stair without surprise, as if he'd expected the knock. His lamp threw amber light over dust and index cards. The room smelled wetter than usual. My skin lifted in gooseflesh before I knew why. I was wrong, I said. Edwin Lowell Granger did not bother pretending not to understand. About the elevator. About all of it being one creature. He set down the ledger he was holding. Good. I almost laughed at that. Good. If you'd caught a single monster, Garrett Owen Sutter, this would have been a much kinder world. He moved aside a stack of county plats and pulled out a long rolled map tied with string gone brittle. Then another. Then a third. When he spread them on the table, I saw roads, creek beds, property lines, and circles in red pencil around abandoned structures across half the region. Schools, factories, farmhouses, a burned motel, 2 churches with their steeples marked off in Edwin Lowell Granger's careful hand. Grain elevators, empty depots, lines connected them, not road lines, sequence lines, a path of occupancy and disuse, buildings aging into usefulness. These are exchange points, Edwin Lowell Granger said softly. Local chambers, conduits, storage. For what? He looked at me like I'd arrived late to class. For us, or rather, for what passes through us and survives longer than our bodies do. That was when I followed him. Not then exactly. Not in that second. But from that moment on I stopped treating Edwin Lowell Granger as a helpful civilian and started treating him like a man standing too comfortably at the edge of something that had been watching me from the day I arrived. That should have been my warning. Instead it became my next lead. I didn't tell Sheriff Miriam Jovas what I was doing. By then I wasn't sure which of us would remember the conversation correctly if I did. Edwin Lowell Granger closed the archive at 10, turned out the lamps, and walked home with the slow, careful pace of an older man used to uneven sidewalks. I waited in my car with the engine off and the night insects scraping at the silence. At 11:40 he came back out. Not from his house. From the alley behind it. He carried a satchel heavy enough to pull one shoulder down. I followed at a distance along back streets and service lanes until he reached the condemned schoolhouse at the edge of Black Creek. The place had been closed for 15 years after foundation trouble and mold. Its windows were boarded. The playground beside it was half sunk into crabgrass. The smell hit me before I got through the fence. Wetwood, old paper, and that metallic electrical hum so steady it blurred into nausea. Edwin Lowell Granger slipped through a side door already unlocked. I waited a full minute, then went in after him. The hallway floor had gone soft in patches. Plaster dust coated my tongue. Somewhere water dripped in a rhythm just uneven enough to keep me listening for a pattern. Edwin Lowell Granger's flashlight moved ahead of me through the dark, crossing old classroom doors with curling numbers still tacked above them. He entered one at the end of the hall. I stopped outside and listened. No talking. No footsteps except his. Then the soft thump of something set on a desk. I edged to the doorway and looked in. Moonlight leaked through a gap in the boards over the windows. Edwin Lowell Granger stood beside a teacher's desk with his satchel open. On the desktop lay 3 journals, 1 ledger, and a bundle of loose photographs tied in twine. He arranged them neatly, almost respectfully, then stepped back. "That's this month's record," he said into the room. The silence after that had weight. Then shapes unfolded from the back of the classroom. They hadn't been there a second earlier. Or maybe they had, and my eyes had refused to keep them. 3 figures, each different in height and proportion but sharing the same awful economy of movement. One carried its shoulders too high, as if its neck had been borrowed from some other design. Another kept one hand folded against its chest while the other reached. Their fingertips looked blanched and layered, like pages stuck together from damp. When one passed the blackboard, it left no shadow on it at all. Edwin Lowell Granger smiled and tipped his hat. Not in fear. Not in worship exactly. In recognition. One of the figures took the top journal, lifted it to where a face should have been, and went still. My own eyes throbbed so sharply I had to brace against the doorframe. In that instant I smelled pipe smoke, my grandfather's basement, old pennies in a palm, a fever dream I hadn't had since childhood. Memories that weren't in the room. Memories pouring loose around me. The thing wasn't reading. It was ingesting. I backed away too fast and the floorboard under my heel gave a dry crack. All 3 figures turned toward the door at once. I ran. I don't mean I stumbled in panic. I ran the way a professional runs when he has finally admitted a premise is true and survival depends on adapting faster than shame. The hallway seemed longer going back. The hum followed me, rising until I could feel it in my teeth. Behind me there were no chasing footfalls, which made it worse. Only the sound of classroom doors gently clicking shut one after another as I passed. By the time I reached the car, my nose was bleeding. I sat behind the wheel with the copper taste in my mouth and understood one thing with total clarity. Edwin Lowell Granger wasn't serving monsters in secret. He was feeding records into a system he believed had every right to keep them. The next morning I confronted him, and he didn't deny any of it. We met in the archive before opening. The place smelled soaked through, as if the walls had absorbed a storm. He looked tired, not guilty. You left them journals, I said. I left them continuity. They took people. Yes. The simplicity of that answer made my hands shake harder than if he'd tried to justify it. Edwin Lowell Granger folded his own together on the table. And people lose people every day to rot, flood, fire, war, neglect, and time. The difference is that this system keeps what we drop. They aren't preserving people. They're using them. His mouth tightened. Those aren't opposite things. I wanted to dismiss that as the madness of a man who'd spent too long cataloging grief. But I had seen the classroom. I had felt memories spill around the room like static. Whatever those entities were doing, it involved storage, transfer, and selection with a precision far beyond feeding. Then Edwin Lowell Granger handed me a photograph from a folder I hadn't noticed. It showed a search party outside an abandoned cannery in Illinois in the 1950s. 8 people stood in muddy coats. In the broken window behind them, half obscured by glare, was a figure I recognized at once. Not because I had seen its face, because the posture was the same impossible vertical wrongness from the grain elevator footage. It had not aged. Not a day. A missing person's photograph from Arkansas showed the same outline near a tree line in the 1970s. Another from Kansas placed it in a grainy reflection 30 years later. Not one clear shot. Never centered. Always present just enough to be found later by somebody already looking. How widespread? I asked. Edwin Lowell Granger didn't answer directly. He pulled a county map closer and spread the others beneath it until the table held a fan of states. Red circles everywhere. Some connected. Some isolated until a rail line or river route made the relationship obvious. Structures aging into vacancy. Vacancies joining patterns. Patterns feeding other patterns. I finally asked the right question in the wrong tone. What is this built on? Edwin Lowell Granger looked at me with pity then, which I hated more than fear. On human recall, Garrett Owen Sutter. On our need to tell each other what happened. On the gap between the event and the telling. That's where they live. He pointed to the erased house on the Black Creek block. Then to the grain elevator. Then to the schoolhouse. Those aren't nests. They're local organs. Cells, if you like. Structures where processing can happen. The thing you chased into the elevator wasn't the cause. It was a courier. A worker. Maybe a custodian. This isn't predation in the simple sense. It's traffic. That was the first time the scale of it made me feel small in a way I couldn't intellectualize away. Because if he was right, every old story I'd filed under rural superstition, every contradictory witness account I'd blamed on shock, every town that forgot one house too completely, all of it belonged to one hidden system. Not scattered monsters. Not isolated species. Parts of a continent-wide intelligence using human memory the way we use copper wire or roads. I didn't understand what I was inside yet, but I knew by then that Black Creek was not a singular case. It was a junction, and somebody had wanted me to find it. The clue that led me into the hills had been in the composition notebook from the elevator all along, buried in what I first took for bookkeeping. Each crossed-out name corresponded to a date. Each date matched a weather notation in a farm almanac Edwin Lowell Granger kept in his side collection. When overlaid with his red circle maps, the sequence pointed northwest through abandoned properties and washed out access roads toward a settlement no current county map still named. I went alone. Not because that was wise, because by then I trusted no chain of recollection that involved more than one mind. Sheriff Miriam Jovas would have stopped me if I told her. Or she would have agreed and forgotten by morning. I packed paper maps, extra batteries, a recorder, and enough food for 2 days. The truck tires hissed over gravel, then mud, then a track little better than twin ruts through thick timber. The deeper I went, the more the air changed. Cooler. Wetter. It smelled like soaked bark and archival boxes left open in a basement. The buzz started before I saw the first building. A cabin leaned out of the trees, roof half-caved, porch sagging. Then another. Then a communal hall with no sign left over the door, only 2 rusty bolts where one had been. The settlement had not been destroyed. It had been set aside. That was worse. Destruction leaves emotion. This place felt administratively abandoned, as if human use had ended exactly when some other use became viable. I killed the engine and listened. No birds. No insects. Just the hum and, under it, something like whispering too far away to parse. I moved through the first cabin with my flashlight low. The floor was dry despite the smell. Shelves lined one wall, and on those shelves sat objects so ordinary they unsettled me more than bones would have. A lunch pail with a child's initials scratched into the lid. A theater ticket stub sealed in wax paper. Recipe cards. A bus transfer. A hair ribbon. 50, maybe 60 items, each tagged in pencil with a date and a county. Not trophies. Filed pieces. The next building held more. Stacks of labeled jars. All empty. Dozens of notebooks. School attendance ledgers. Family Bibles with names written and crossed out. A row of portrait photographs pinned in chronological order that made no sense until I realized each subject had gone missing from a different state, different decade, same age bracket. Some were listed as returned in later clippings. Some never came back. Then I found the people. They were in the meeting hall, seated upright in plain wooden chairs arranged in a wide ring. Men and women, young and old. Some from the photographs. Some I knew only from files, including the missing girl from Black Creek. Alive, breathing, eyes open, no ropes, no cages, no visible restraints at all. But none of them moved. The smell inside that hall was overwhelming. Wet timber, old paper, cold dust, and the faint human scent of skin gone too long without sunlight. My flashlight trembled over their faces. Their expressions weren't blank. Blank would have been easier. Their expressions kept shifting by fractions, as if each person were reacting to scenes I couldn't see. A smile almost forming. Grief passing under the mouth. Confusion, recognition, then gone. Around them moved the entities, more than I had ever seen in one place. Some tall, some stooped, some narrow enough to disappear when they turned sideways between the chairs. None shared one exact shape which mattered. This wasn't a species in the neat biological sense. It was a workforce built to related function. One leaned close to a seated man and touched 2 papery fingers beneath his ear. Another stood before the missing girl and made a low clicking hum that altered pitch in patterned intervals. At each shift, 3 others in the ring responded by turning toward different witnesses. Information passing. Not blood. Not flesh. Memory. I crouched behind a collapsed partition and forced myself to watch. To catalog. When one entity touched a witness, the witness inhaled sharply. At that exact moment, another witness across the room flinched, as if a thought had been yanked through him. When a woman in the back began whispering a nursery rhyme through clenched teeth, an older man near the door abruptly lost whatever expression he'd been wearing and stared down at his own hands like he'd forgotten whose they were. That was Rule 6 in motion. If one witness remembered too much, another witness began forgetting. Not punishment. Load balancing. The pressure behind my eyes rose until tears blurred my vision. Through it, pieces finally aligned. The identical details witnesses reported in unrelated cases weren't truth. They were placeholders, standardized inserts pushed into damaged recollection so local memory stayed stable after real information had been extracted or moved. The famous knock. The lantern in the field. The familiar song. Scripted false details, seeded so communities would tell the same safe story and stop there. And the disappearances. Not simple abductions. Transfers. The people taken from one node were being used as mobile storage. Carriers of lived experience moved through the network when buildings, regions, or branches needed to exchange more than local memory could hold. Human minds were portable containers. Messengers were selected not because they were prey, but because certain memory structures in them made them useful. The missing girl turned her head then and looked straight at where I hid. Her eyes focused. For one impossible second, she knew me. Her lips parted. "Don't let them sort me," she whispered. An entity beside her froze. Then all of them did. That was the worst instant of the entire case. Not the chase. Not the schoolhouse. That stillness. Because it wasn't animal attention. It was network attention, the whole local system registering an intrusion at once. I ran before they moved. Branches slapped wet against my face as I crashed back through the settlement. The hum became layered, no longer one tone but dozens. A chord made from far too many separate sources. Behind me doors opened in sequence. Porch boards groaned. Something brushed a cabin wall without touching the ground. I made it to the truck, jammed the key in, and tore back down the track while my rearview mirror filled with flashes of pale movement between the trees. I drove until sunrise. Then I pulled over on a county road, opened my notebook with shaking hands, and understood the true shape of the case at last. The monsters were not hiding from us. We had been edited around them. By the time I returned to Black Creek, I had gone beyond fear and into a colder state that felt almost like competence, except competence usually gives you options. I had none. Only understanding. I laid everything out in Edwin Lowell Granger's archive because it was the one place where the pieces seemed willing to sit next to each other. Maps, photographs, the notebook from the elevator, my own altered pages, witness timelines, the returned missing persons listed in old clippings. The buzz was present even there now, woven into the walls like a second electrical system. Edwin Lowell Granger watched me without interrupting. "They built infrastructure out of us," I said. He nodded slightly. "Not metaphorically. Literally. Human memory is their connective medium. Buildings are nodes because buildings hold routine. Routine stabilizes recall. Once a place is abandoned long enough, they can occupy the leftover habits without interference. They use witnesses to transmit. They use missing people to move larger volumes. And they keep themselves hidden by editing the recollection around every contact point." Still he said nothing. I pointed to the repeated witness details on my notes. That's why unrelated cases always lose the same specifics. It's not random forgetting. It's standardization. Safe replacement material. If everybody remembers the same knock, nobody goes looking for the real mechanism. A tremor passed behind my eyes. I kept going anyway. The erased house wasn't a haunting. It was a fully consumed site. A node used so long and so thoroughly that the surrounding community memory collapsed around it. The grain elevator creature wasn't the monster behind the case. It was a component, one worker in a larger organism. The journals you leave them aren't offerings. They're updates. Edwin Lowell Granger gave the smallest shrug. Everything living needs records. I ignored him and opened the last folder on the table. It had my name on it. Not written by me on a motel notepad or scrawled in a margin after the fact. Typed cleanly on a county issue cover sheet dated 4 months before I ever drove into Black Creek. Garrett Owen Sutter. Subject line. Beneath that, incident sequence, decision tree, probable reactions. My mouth dried out as I turned the pages. The file recorded my arrival date correctly. Then it recorded smaller things no one should have known. That I would ask to re-interview witnesses in person. That I would pursue structural records after noticing inconsistencies in lot width. That I would isolate the grain elevator as a probable origin point and mistake a courier for a source organism. That I would distrust Edwin Lowell Granger only after the first direct observation of exchange behavior. Several pages near the back were still blank except for headings. Follow-up after settlement contact. Response to subject recognition event. Transfer or release contingency. I put the file down because my hands had started going numb. Loop 3 had been sitting in front of me from the beginning. Information written before the crime occurred. My newest case file had not predicted the future by magic. The collective had modeled me. Maybe from earlier cases. Maybe from reports I didn't know I'd already generated for them. Maybe from contact points so old I'd never marked them as contact at all. The thought that hit hardest was simpler than any theory. How many of my investigations had been mine? I looked at Edwin Lowell Granger. He had gone pale under the dust. How long? I asked. He didn't pretend confusion. Long enough. You knew there was a file on me. I suspected. I did not know the degree. They chose this case for me. They may have routed it toward you, he said. That isn't quite the same. I laughed once, no humor in it. That's a distinction for archivists. Then the rest of the revelation landed all at once. Larger than the file, larger than Black Creek. Every previous scene reassembled. The polite knock outside the missing girl's window had not been a lure from a single creature. It was a synchronization cue. A standardized memory entry point used because it felt ordinary enough to survive retelling. The spiral witnesses drew unconsciously was not decoration or a cult symbol. It was the shape of routing, a cognitive path worn by repeated transfers. The figure appearing in photographs across decades was not immortal in the way stories mean immortal. It was recurring function. A stable courier or overseer present wherever interbranch exchanges required oversight. The changing notes in my own hand were not simply tampering. They were evidence that my recall had already become part of the traffic. I said it out loud because I needed the sentence to exist in air. They're a collective intelligence spread across abandoned structures throughout the country. Separate bodies, shared function. And human memory is the infrastructure that lets them think at scale. Edwin Lowell Granger finally sat down. The chair creaked under him. He looked old then, not mysterious, just old and tired and too far committed. Yes. Why preserve us at all? Because experience is valuable, he said. Because a life observed is data, and a life remembered is transferable. Because extinction frightens them too. That answer was monstrous precisely because it was not meaningless. I could see the shape of the logic. They weren't devils. They weren't predators in the clean animal sense. They were an adjacent civilization built from our cast-off places and our unstable recollection, harvesting, storing, and redistributing human experience while ensuring we never recognized the system whole. And the cost of understanding it was immediate. I could no longer trust my own mind as sealed property. That was the true injury Black Creek left me with. Not the chase. Not the blood from my nose in the schoolhouse. Not the sleepless weeks afterward. It was losing the assumption that my memories began and ended inside me. I took the file with my name on it and burned a copy of the maps into my own coded shorthand. Then I did the only useful thing left. I broke the exchange point. Not the whole network. Nobody could. But the Black Creek branch had a major transfer scheduled through the Hill settlement. The notebook dates, the weather pattern, the returned witness fluctuations all pointed to a narrow window. I brought Sheriff Miriam Jovas what proof I could make physical without sounding insane. Location. Structures. Living missing persons held on site. Enough to justify a recovery operation if not the rest. Sheriff Miriam Jovas looked at me for a long time in her office, the smell of burnt coffee between us. If I ask how you know, am I going to lose the answer? Possibly. That earned the barest exhale from her. Fine. Then I'm not asking. We went up there with rescue, state support, and enough vehicles to look official on paper. Daylight helped. Whatever occupied the settlement was less willing to stage itself under a full sun. Or maybe it simply didn't need to. We found the meeting hall nearly empty. Chairs overturned. Shelves stripped. But not everyone had been moved in time. 7 missing people were recovered from 3 structures. Dehydrated. Disoriented. Alive. Including the girl from Black Creek. 2 more wandered out of the tree line after dusk. Shoeless and blank-eyed. As if released once the operation made continued storage inconvenient. They had no useful memory of where they'd been. Most couldn't account for more than fragments. A song. Damp boards under bare feet. The taste of pennies. One man insisted he'd spent months working in a factory that no longer existed. Another asked for his mother, who had been dead 15 years. Edwin Lowell Granger was gone by the time we returned to town. Archive keys left on his desk. Maps missing. Journals removed. No note. Nothing theatrical. Just absence, which somehow suited him better than a confession ever could. Sheriff Miriam Jovas put out a quiet notice and never found him. I have my own ideas about where he went, and none of them end with a body. Black Creek resumed normal life the way injured people sometimes do, by choosing function before understanding. The returned missing people came home to families who accepted miracle over explanation. The grain elevator was sealed and later demolished, though I knew that meant almost nothing. Other abandoned sites remained. Other lines on Edwin Lowell Granger's maps continued past county and state borders until the red marks became too many to count. We won something there. I won't lie about that. A branch was disrupted. A transfer failed. People came back who would have otherwise vanished into the network longer or forever. That matters. But victory was the wrong shape for it. Because the larger system adapted exactly as any intelligence would. After Black Creek, reports in neighboring counties shifted rather than stopped. The witness details changed. No more knocks for a while. New safe stories appeared in their place. A woman hearing her own name called from an empty feed store. 3 fishermen all certain they'd seen porch lights across the lake where no house stood. Standardized replacements. Revised script. Months later, I was back at my desk with a new case file from Indiana. Another disappearance. Another abandoned structure. Another witness set that matched too neatly. Rain tapped the office window, and the smell of wet paper rose from the folder before I even opened it. That never used to happen. Now I notice it every time. I opened the file and felt the blood leave my face. Inside the front cover, on a yellow note stuck to the first page, was a sentence in my own handwriting. You've already investigated this one. No date. No explanation. No memory of writing it. I sat there for a long time listening to rain and that faint electric hum that has no business existing in a building wired correctly. Then I checked the margins, the backs of the photographs, the lot maps, every place a message could hide if it knew how I worked. That's what changed in me. Not courage. Not paranoia exactly. Habit. I read every case now like it may have passed through my hands before they were mine.